So good morning. Today what we're going to be doing is going over the idea of layers, cameras, and working with objects in 3 dimensions in motion. I'm going to take inspiration from this animation that we saw at the end of Lemony Snicket's. It's the credit sequence, and I really like the style that the animator used. So we're going to kind of use that style as the basis for our next piece of work here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by opening up Photoshop, as you can see here, and I'm going to create a new document. So we're going to do a width of 3000 and a height of 1000. This will give us something that we can actually expand past the boundaries. And I'm going to go ahead and hit create, and that gives me this nice long document. I'm going to double click the background to turn it into a normal layer, kind of like we normally do. And this time I can't delete it until I get a new layer, but we're going to actually fill it with a pattern. And if you've seen the last tutorial, you know that if we open up our patterns window, it's under patterns here, you can just click on click anywhere with that pattern that we created, and it'll fill this entire layer 0. Which is great. Now I'm going to take that pattern and merge it down, Shift Select, so I select both layers, and then Command E, just like we talked about. Now this is a normal layer that I can actually start to edit. This is going to be my waves, and they'll kind of like move this way. And so what I want to do at the top here is create like a wave shape. Now I could do this just by drawing if I wanted to, right, with the lasso tool, but I'm going to cheat and select the elliptical marquee tool like that. I'm just going to actually move this into place like this, select the elliptical marquee tool, and I'm just going to create like an oval right here, and then hit the delete button. And now what I'm going to do is just physically hold the shift key down and move it over a little bit like this, and then hit the delete button again. Now if this were Illustrator, you could just do this with a keyboard shortcut at this point, but we're just physically moving this oval over with holding the shift key down so it moves in a straight line, and then hitting the delete button every once in a while. What that will give me are these nice little waves, which we will then just use motion to layer into. I've got these little tops here, so I'm just going to go to the rectangular marquee tool here and just take all those tops that were just left over and just hit delete and select them and delete them. So now we've got our wave, right, and it looks okay. But I would love a stroke along the top to kind of separate the different layers. And we can do that very easily by going to the effects drop down here in the layers and just selecting outer stroke or stroke in general, right? And we'll just move this aside, and we can make the stroke any color we want. So if I want to make it white, that's great. We can make it really fat or really small. And I'm going to be positioning this outside so I get a nice, you can kind of see if I zoom in, it's on the outside, so I get a nice peak here. If you put this on the inside, you'll see that kind of, well, it actually doesn't look too bad actually either. So outside or inside kind of both give us a nice peak here. But I'm happy with this, and I'm going to change the size to about 3, just enough to separate the two waves, and then we're going to zoom out. Now, again, just like we talk about all the time, you cannot use any of these effects or any of the specialty things in Photoshop in motion. So in order to use this, we have to take the effects here, right click on that, and rasterize this layer. By rasterizing that, it turns the effect into actual pixels, and now we can actually export this for motion. So I'm just going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as on my desktop here as wave.psd. And I'm just going to replace it because I had one before. Now another thing we're going to want on our wave is a boat. So I'm going to go to File, New, and I'm just going to create a document that's about the right size, right, 1920 by 1080, and double clicking the background, hitting OK, layer 0. I'm going to select everything, select all, Command A, and I'm just going to hit the delete button so we have a transparent image like this. Now, just like we saw in the pattern video, I'd love to create a little boat. So one thing I can do is just start with my elliptical marquee tool, deselect, Command D, and this is like a boat shape here. And what I'm going to do is take my brush tool, B for brush, change it to black, pick a brush that's just basic, let's see, how about my general brushes hard round, and change the size to about 50. And you'll see that because I've got that marquee selected, I can't draw outside of that boundary. So what I'm doing is just creating a nice organic boat shape like this. Now let's make the brush a little bigger with our bracket key and kind of fill this in. Now if I wanted to make this a straight line up here, I could just click here once, hold the shift key down, and click here, and that would straighten that up. But I don't want that. I kind of like the organic look, and I'm going to hit the E for eraser tool, and I'm just going to give this a little bit more of a hand created thing. Now I'm going to deselect, and now I've got this little boat where people could be sitting in it. Now I don't want the boat to be black, but we already saw that we can actually just go to our pattern area here and just click on any of the patterns that we've saved, and you'll notice that that makes a clipping mask and fills that boat with that pattern. Now I don't like this pattern. I would love it to be a little bit more, a little smaller, so double clicking our pattern fill area allows me to change my scale to about 90. Now you can do whatever you want as far as your pattern's concerned, and I'm just going to rotate it a little bit just to see how that looks. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so now that I've got my layer filling in the boat, what I'm going to do is right click on the pattern layer, and I'm going to merge this downwards right here, and what that does is it crushes that pattern into layer 0 like that. Now at this point I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to add an effect, and I'm going to do a stroke just like we did for the wave, and you'll see that it's white and it has all the same settings that we had before. It has some interesting things happening here, but we're going to just hit OK, and now we're going to right click on this layer 0, rasterize layer style, and that actually embeds that layer style into the pixel layer, as you can see here. I'm going to go ahead and say File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as boat and put it in Photoshop, and replace the boat file that I already have. All right, at this point we're going to close everything up in Photoshop, and we're going to head over to Motion to create our Motion project. So here we are in Motion, and what we're going to do is create a new Motion document that's 1080, and we're going to make it a total of 30 seconds long. So just change this to 3:30:00, and hit Open, and that will initiate our window for Motion. We're going to import our two files that we just created. They are located here, and there's my boat and there is my wave. So I'm just going to select both of these. Now the nice thing is that both of these are not layered, and you'll notice that when they come in, they're going to actually fill up the entire space, but they're actually bigger than this. So if I make this 50%, you'll see that my wave under the inspector here, the scale is actually set to 64, and we want that to be 100. Remember, we made that wave bigger intentionally so it would come off the screen, as you can kind of see here. Our boat layer is the right size, but I actually want it to be a little smaller based on what I'm seeing here. So I've got my boat here, and I'm just going to turn it to 50%, and just visually looking at it. And the boat is above the wave, and we can put it behind if we wanted to. So right now we have something that's a little bit okay. We would love to see a color background, so I'm going to go ahead and add Object Generator, and I'm just going to make a solid color background, color solid. Change the color to something a little more gray. Now remember, you could have just exported a nice pattern as well in Photoshop, and that would have been a great background, but we're going to simplify this just so we can see what's going on. I put the color on the bottom just so you can see my layers here. Now, we are going to be working in 3 dimensions. So currently, if you look at this little icon for this group right here, this says it's in 2 dimensions. If I click on that, I have now made this a 3-dimensional object, even though it doesn't look like it. So clicking on these things will bring them from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit in the next couple minutes in Motion here. Now, in order to just get these waves to actually be moving, what I'd like to do is just start with a single wave here, and I'm not going to worry about the boat or the background. But I'm going to add two behaviors to this wave. One that goes up and down because of motion of the water goes up and down, and then one that goes left and right like this because the water kind of does that. Both of those are our parameter oscillate, right? So we're going to start with one, and we're going to apply that to up and down position, which is x, and y. Y is up and down, okay? And we can kind of see that that water is going up and down. It's going up and down quite a bit, so I'm going to lower the amplitude to about 50. Now we've got an up and down motion there. And then we're going to add one more motion to this wave, and it's the same parameter, only this time we're going to add it to the y position. So this time the x position, back and forth. Now you'll notice that when you do that, you get a straight line, which is not going to sell this thing. It's working on a diagonal. And the reason is because they're both in phase with each other, and the speed's identical. If you modify the speed and make this a little bit slower, you'll notice you get different kind of patterns here. And the more complex the pattern, the more complex the wave will be. So if I change the speed for one of them to maybe 7, that looks pretty complex. Actually 8 looks really complex, and you'll see what this looks like. It'll trace this pattern out. So as soon as you got something that looks like a really good pattern and you've got the speed that you want, currently the speed and the amplitude are a little bit high for me, just changing the amplitude here. So I've got something that I'm looking at that I really like. This kind of reminds me of a wave. I can now take this wave along with all the motions that I've added to it and duplicate it, Command D, and now that makes two waves. And so you can see that if I take the second wave, take the one on top here so you can see it, if I take the second wave and pull it down, I've got two waves, and they're both identically moving because we have the identical oscillations. But the wave that I just created, which is this top one, what I'm going to do is slightly change the phase. And now, because I've changed the phase slightly, they start at different points, but they still have the same speed. So it makes it look a lot more believable. You can kind of see that. I'm going to do that 2 more times. So Command D to duplicate, open up the new wave on top, move it down so I can see it. It's identical in sync here, so we're going to change the phase again. Now that's out of phase, which means it's doing the same thing, but it's doing it at a different time. And then we're going to do this one more time. Command D, open this up, select our oscillate, and change our phase for both of these X and Y's. Okay, so now we see that we've got our waves. Let's go ahead and turn on our boat. And what we're going to do is put our boat in between the waves so that it's inside. We're going to bring it down, and we're just going to hit the space bar, and we can kind of see right away that it's not looking exactly like we hoped. Obviously the boat is just not moving at all, right? I'm going to hit the pan button so you can kind of see. I would love the boat to have the same movement as this front wave right here. So this is the wave I would like to have the movement from. And what I'm going to do is just open up that and take that oscillate behavior, and I'm going to option drag that onto our boat. Then I'm going to take the other one and option drag that onto the boat. So now that has duplicated, so you can kind of see that that boat now is stuck on that wave. Now that boat should be moving slightly different from the wave. So again, we're just going to go to the boat, click on oscillate, and we're going to change the phase by maybe just 1 to 17. You can see that's still close, but it's not quite the same as that wave. So again, we're looking at this wave, and it's close enough, but it's not identical, which actually helps to sell that. We're going to bring that boat down a little bit into the waves because we're looking at it to see if it actually is functioning. I like this wave that's closest to us right here. That's this one, and I'm going to bring that down just so it doesn't interfere with that back wave. And at that point, I'm pretty happy. The boat feels like it's moving on its own, but it's staying pretty close to that initial wave that it's in front of. It's not changing too much from that because of the phase that we added was very slight. All right. Let's continue on here. I'm going to go back to, I'm going to put this at 50% so we can see what we're going on. So here's what we have so far, and this is in 2 dimensions. So what I'm going to do is close these guys up, and I'm going to add an object that will allow everything to be in 3 dimensions. I'm going to add a camera. Now when I add the camera for the first time, it's going to take whatever I'm looking at in the scene, which is this scene, and it's going to map that into where the camera is starting. So I'm going to switch to 3D. And now I've got a camera. Even though it doesn't look like anything's changed, I physically have a camera in the space. And the kind of camera it is, if you look over here, is a framing camera. Now, its angle of view is 45 degrees, so think of a 45 millimeter lens. It's kind of like how this works. And if you want to see the camera, we've got this new active camera button. If you click on it, we can go to perspective, and this will allow us to see our scene in a 3-dimensional view, and actually use these little dials up here to kind of see what we physically have in our motion file. And you can kind of see that we've got our plane with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objects stacked in it, and it's all on the zero Z axis right there, right? So it's all really flat. And then we have far away, we have our camera, and it's framing in that element so that when we look through the camera, this is what we're actually seeing, right? We're seeing exactly this. So the nice part about having a camera is that you can actually move the camera. So if we go to properties and we just move the X position, you can see it just moves left to right. You kind of see how that works, right? So if you were to keyframe this camera, you know, starting, maybe you want to start like in some, like over here, and then have it pan over here, it would actually introduce a kind of a motion, a dolly motion. And again, to see how that looks in perspective with the camera, I'll move the X position. You can see the camera is physically moving in space left to right. Now what makes this really nice and more interesting is to have objects that are different distances from the camera. And that's what we're going to do next. And everything currently is in the 0 Z axis. So if I click any one of these objects like this and go to the position, I'll close this up so you don't have to see all this stuff, you'll see that the Z is at 0. But if I actually change that Z to bring it in closer, you can see my active camera at the bottom right hand corner of the window, but you can see that brings it in closer and makes it in essence larger, which is just fine, right? So what I'd like to do is move all of these objects at different parts to put them in different planes, in essence, to separate them. And in order to help me, what I'm going to do is label each one of these waves W, and then I'm going to say, okay, the first one is at 200 pixels. So when I do that, I'm going to open this up so you can see W200. I am now going to take that Z value and put it at 200. And you can see what I've just did was to bring that forward. The next wave is where the boat is, and I'm just going to call it W for wave, and then I'm going to say 0 because it's going to be at 0 position for the Z, and W0, that's where it is. I'm going to leave my boat alone. I know that that is on the 0, but I'm going to actually pull that back. The next wave, I'm going to actually bring behind everything, so I'm going to put negative 200 and put it at the Z of negative 200, and you can see what that does. It actually pulls it back to this area. And then finally the wave in the back, I'm going to put that at negative 400, so W negative 400. This is what I want, negative 400. So now I have 4 things you can kind of see, and if I look through my camera just to see how it is, you can see it looks similar, although the things in the back appear smaller and the things in the front appear a little bit larger. The nice part is now if I move my camera left to right, you get a little bit of the parallax. Do you notice how the waves themselves feel dimensional? They feel like they're moving in 3 dimensions and not just flat. And that's the nice part about having objects that are grouped in 3 dimensions, right? If I go to perspective, you can see that happening when I move the X and the Y up and down, left and right. I get a little bit of that parallax action going as if they're in different parts of the space. Now that boat, as you can kind of see, is still at 0. So with the boat, I'm going to actually make that at negative 100 so that it's behind the front wave, but in between two waves still. You see that? Okay. And we're just going to, again, I'm going to try to make this easy. BOAT negative 100. I just need to know where these objects are in space so that it makes my life a little bit easier once I'm doing these things. I'm going to turn the color solid on, and you'll notice that that color solid's still at 0. And if I looked at the camera view, it would be filling the frame, but it's like occluding the objects. Even though it's at the bottom, it's still in front of the negative 100, negative 200. So one object, one thing that you can do is take that color solid and move it behind the farthest thing away. So obviously negative 400, so I can make it negative 500 or something. That moves it behind everything, and obviously now it's too small, so I can scale that up so that it's in frame. Another thing you can do is take that, I'm going to undo that and still put it where it is. If this color solid were not part of the three-dimensional world, it would just be in the back. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this color solid and we're going to create a new group for it. If I click group and create a group just for this color solid, you'll notice that this group is 3D. But if I take this group and turn it into a 2D object, just like that, and move this out of our previous group right here, this wave group, you'll notice that it is now as if when we started. Do you notice that no matter what you do, I'm going to go to perspective, it's going to be in the background. Do you see that? In essence, what we're doing is we're not playing the camera game with this group. But if I ever put it into the 3D group, it goes back to where it is in space, which is at 0 pixels distance. So this is a nice way of like having something in the background, like having an entire background of color that doesn't is not affected by the camera, obviously, or it's not affected by any 3D things that we put in. But of course, sometimes we want it to be affected by those things, and so you can take that group, put it at negative 500, and now it's behind things. And if we look through our camera, we can see that we just need to scale that group or scale that color solid. I'm just going to scale the group itself so that it makes that really big. So now that object is in our space, and we now have a three-dimensional thing that we can actually add one more element to really sell this, this shot. We're going to go to Add Object and select Light, and go to Perspective so we can see where that light is and how it's affecting what we're seeing. And you can see right away that the light is currently in front of all the layers. You can kind of see. And now if we move the light forward or backwards, you can actually illuminate different things. And I'm just going to go to the camera view so you can better see this. So I'm going to select the blue arrow for the light, which is the z-axis. In fact, I'm going to show you the properties so you can see where we are and see how that changes. So if we bring the light back all the way to the back, it only illuminates that color solid that we have at the bottom at 500. As we move this light forward, you can see it starts to illuminate each of these objects in turn, but the light falls off as it goes backwards. We can bring the light down and pull it forward. You can kind of see how this works. And so as it illuminates the things that are it's closest to, so like something like this, you can kind of see that. So the light itself can actually create some really beautiful looks, and you can kind of see now all of a sudden the whole scene seems like it's a little bit more cohesive with this one light. Now this light also has some other properties beside intensity, which we can increase or decrease. We could play with the fall off, which means it becomes more or less of a point light. You can kind of see you're only allowing the light to actually affect things that it's closest to. So I can even change the intensity, but change the fall off, start or stop. You can kind of see how that works. And that makes the light more like a little lamp light or a little firefly, right? Another thing you can do with the light, which is really nice, and just put the intensity back, is add a shadow. By clicking on the shadow tool and showing that, what happens is you create, take this light here, you create shadows. You see that? So by this light will actually now cast shadows where before it wasn't casting shadows. So you can kind of see now we have shadows being cast, which is really nice. Maybe I'll increase the intensity so you can see these shadows. The shadows, you can make them softer, so they're a little bit less intense, and you can change their opacity so that they're not so intense as well. So now all of a sudden we have something that looks fairly three-dimensional, you can kind of see, with our shadows being cast. Now, one thing that you can do with objects, because this is not the real world, I'm going to change the softness to 64, make it really soft, maybe a little less, and change the opacity so you can see it. One thing, we don't want this green background to actually receive a shadow. So if I go to that group or that color solid, under properties, you'll notice it has a shadow tab here. And if I show that, it says I can cast shadows and receive shadows. If you want an object to not receive any of these shadows, just turn off receive shadows, and all of a sudden the object acts like a piece of glass for shadows. It does not allow the object to be seen, or the shadows to be seen on that. You can also turn off the cast shadows, and that will make the object not cast any shadows at all. Okay, so hopefully, if I go to perspective, you can see what we've actually created. We've got our light in our scene right here, right? And it's casting shadows. We've got our waves, 1, 2, 3, and 4, each one with motion. We've got our boat that's receiving a shadow. We have a background group that's not receiving any shadows. We've got our camera, right? And then finally, one last thing we could do is add a little bit of motion to the camera. So we're going to select our camera. We're going to start over here on the x-axis and set a keyframe for x for our camera. Then we're going to move to the right-hand side here, and we're going to now move the camera a little bit so that we don't see anything go out of frame, like to something like that. That introduces a little bit of motion. I'm going to go actually a little bit to here. So even though it doesn't appear to be the case, it is moving from left to right, and you can kind of see that in our animation tab here. And you'll notice that it's not a continuous movement. It slowly starts and then ends slowly. So if we want to change that interpolation to linear, that's going to give us a more linear motion from left to right. You can kind of see that happening here. And so what we get is this nice scene, a light, a camera that's moving, individual waves that are moving using oscillation, a boat that's also oscillating but very similar to one of the waves. And hopefully this was useful for you, for your project that you're doing. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll talk a little bit more about cameras and lights, as well as motion blur and 3 dimensions in the next tutorial.